So, you definitely know the name Susan B. Anthony. But what if we stopped thinking of her as just some face on an old coin and saw her for what she really was? A revolutionary. A woman who was arrested, put on trial, all for the simple act of casting a vote. Her story is about the fight for a right many of us now take for granted, and it all kicked off in a courtroom. Just listen to these words. This is a woman on trial, staring down a judge and a system built to keep her silent. This quote, it just captures that fire that defined her whole life. For Anthony, this wasn't just about breaking some rule. It was a deep, personal violation of her rights as a citizen.
And that really brings us to a question that, let's be honest, sounds completely absurd today, right? How could voting, the very foundation of democracy, be a crime for an American citizen? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the 19th century.
Okay, so picture this. The year is 1872. We're in Rochester, New York. Susan B. Anthony and 14 other women walk into a polling place and cast their ballots in the presidential election. A few weeks go by, and then a U.S. deputy marshal shows up at her door to arrest her for illegal voting. This one single act of defiance was about to set the stage for one of the most famous trials in American history.
So what gives a woman in the 1800s the guts to do something so radical? I mean, where does that conviction come from? To really get Anthony's mindset, we have to look at her roots. Her activism wasn't something she just picked up as an adult. It was basically in her DNA from childhood.
Anthony grew up in a household that was, for all intents and purposes, a hub for radical social change. Her Quaker family believed deeply in social equality. Her father was a staunch abolitionist, and by the time she was 17, she was already out there collecting anti-slavery petitions. Their family farm was a regular meeting spot for activists like Frederick Douglass, who became a lifelong friend. For her, fighting for justice was just what you did.
But the fight for women's rights? That became intensely personal in 1852. She was at a temperance convention, and when she stood up to speak, she was told that women delegates were there to listen and learn. That public smackdown was a turning point. She realized right then and there that until women had a political voice, they'd never be able to effectively fight for any other cause.
And not long after that, she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And this meeting, this partnership, it literally changed American history. They were the perfect team. Stanton, who was usually at home with her 7 kids, was the brilliant writer and philosopher of the movement. Anthony, who was unmarried and could travel, became its public face, the unstoppable organizer and speaker. As Stanton famously said, "I forged the thunderbolts, she fired them."
And you can't sum up their dynamic any better than this quote from Stanton's husband, Henry. He used to joke, "Susan stirred the puddings, Elizabeth stirred up Susan, and then Susan stirs up the world." It's just a perfect little window into this deep friendship and incredibly effective partnership that blended everyday life with world-changing goals.
So together, they built a national movement from the ground up. And Anthony wasn't just a speaker. She was what one historian called the incomparable organizer. For 50 years, she was the engine of the suffrage movement, giving it a direction, a strategy, and a relentless forward momentum.
To get a sense of the sheer scale of her work, just think about this. During the Civil War, she and Stanton started the Women's Loyal National League to push for the amendment to abolish slavery. They collected almost 400,000 signatures. Now, in an era with no internet, no social media, that was the biggest petition drive the country had ever seen. This was more than just activism. It was a masterclass in political organizing.
And this really became her blueprint for activism, her playbook. It was this relentless, four-pronged attack. She was constantly giving speeches all over the country, organizing these huge petition drives, tirelessly lobbying politicians in Washington, and building national organizations to keep the fight going for the long haul.
And the personal sacrifice this took, it's just hard to wrap your head around. For decades, she gave between 75 and 100 speeches a year. She was traveling by horse and buggy, old trains. I mean, one time her train got snowbound for days and she had to survive on just crackers and dried fish. And all this grueling work was funded almost entirely by the small fees she earned from speaking.
But her journey wasn't simple or without controversy, even inside the movements she was leading. The years right after the Civil War would really test her principles and lead to a pretty painful split among her fellow activists.
And here's where it got really complicated. The 15th Amendment was a huge step forward, saying you couldn't deny the vote based on race. But, and this is a huge but, it also introduced the word male
into the Constitution for the very first time. Anthony and Stanton were absolutely furious. After all their work for universal rights, they saw this as a massive betrayal.
She argued this created what she called an aristocracy of sex. Her point was that if you give the vote to all men, black and white, while shutting out all women, you're essentially writing into the Constitution that men are a ruling class. It would make every man legally superior to every woman. For her, this was a giant step backward, and she absolutely refused to support it.
And this brings us right back to where we started. Her opposition to the 15th Amendment is what fueled her new strategy of direct action. Her thinking was, if the Constitution won't give me the right to vote, I'll just take it. And so, just a couple of years after that amendment was ratified, she walked into that polling station, cast her ballot, and got arrested.
Her trial, officially the United States versus Susan B. Anthony, became a national spectacle. But honestly, it was a total sham. The judge had already written his opinion before the trial even started. He refused to let her testify in her own defense, and then, get this, he literally ordered the all-male jury to return a guilty verdict. He completely denied her a trial by her peers.
When the judge asked if she had anything to say before her sentence, she stood up and delivered one of the most blistering speeches in the history of the movement. And when he sentenced her to a $100 fine, she looked him in the eye and gave him this legendary response.
And she never did. Not one penny. Now, the judge was clever. He knew if he threw her in jail for not paying, she could appeal to the Supreme Court. So he didn't, which blocked her legal path forward. But Anthony still got the last word. Refusing to pay that fine was her final, powerful act of civil disobedience.
So even though she lost that legal battle, Anthony was smart. She used all the attention from the trial to fire up the suffrage movement. It turned a legal defeat into a massive moral victory and cemented her place as the face of the cause, setting the stage for the final big push.
And over the next few decades, something amazing happened. Public perception of her started to shift, radically. For years, the press had mocked her, calling her an enemy of marriage and the family. But just through her sheer persistence and dignity, she won the nation's respect. On her 80th birthday, she was celebrated as an honored guest at the White House by President William McKinley.
But the fight was still so far from over. An amendment for women's suffrage was first introduced way back in 1878. It eventually became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, but she wouldn't live to see it pass. She died in 1906. It wasn't until 1920, 14 years after her death, that the 19th Amendment was finally ratified using the exact same words she had fought for her entire life. Just before she died, Anthony gave her final public speech, and after looking back on decades of struggle and knowing all the work that was still ahead, she closed with 3 simple, powerful words. Failure is impossible became the rallying cry, the watchword that carried the movement through those final years to victory.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Anthony once said she was worried that future generations would have no idea of how every single inch of ground they stand on was gained through the hard work of a few. And that's really a question for us today, isn't it? In a world where it's so easy to take our rights for granted, have we forgotten the struggle?